so let's take a look at Legacy of Dragonholt here. This is fairly recent, and honestly, I bought this kind of on a whim. I was at the game store, and the workers there were kind of recommending it to some people who were looking for something kind of storyteller-ish, whatever, and it sounded interesting to me. I elicited some more information from them as well, and it convinced me that it was something my wife and I would enjoy. So I picked it up. I usually don't buy things on this kind of impulse, but, well, I don't know. I did. Let's take a quick look at some of the rules. This is just going to be a quick hit because I'm not going to play this in front of the camera. The reason being it basically would be completely a spoiler, but I will give some of the thoughts about it, maybe a little bit. So, at the beginning of the game, first thing you should do is read this rule book, right? The rule book tells you a few things. You don't really know what the object is. You're going to get that during the story, honestly. It's like a role-playing game, but it's baked into the books. Yeah, look a little bit at the components. You have the rule book, as I said. You have a character creation book, which is actually fairly rich for what the game requires. It gives some detail and information on the different races. And what you're going to do at the beginning of the game is basically choose a race. Then you pick a class within that race. That's going to restrict the skills. Between the two of those, that's going to restrict the skills that you're going to have. A lot of it's flavor. You can build up a character description. The game's probably more fun if you do so, because you'll be able to tap more into your own, role-playing feeling about how your character is. There's a lot of, we'll get to this in a moment, but a lot of setting up in terms of, hey, set up your personality and ideals, your background, what you look like, your name, all kind of stuff like that. None of that really matters to the play of the game any more than it does to the game system in a role-playing game, right? But it can help you sort of connect with your character and understand what kind of choices you're going to make. But then the important thing that you're going to do is pick your skills. And in a sense, you could kind of not do any of this other stuff, although some of it is race-related. If you're a certain race, you get benefits with certain of the encounters. If you're other races, you get benefits with other encounters throughout the game. But the main thing that's going to decide your capabilities in the game is your skill set. And you're going to start with 5 skills, but you can buy, up to 3 more in your starting character. The 5 skills that you get, 2 of them come from your race, 2 of them come from your background, and there can be overlap there. So you might have to do some balancing, saying, I'll take this one from my race because I can't find as many good things from my race, but my class, race and class, my class is very cool for something. And then you got 1 free one that you can take from the entire list. Now, beyond that though, you can buy up to 3 more. Which are absolutely free ones in terms that they can come from anywhere in the list, but the cost for them is going to be in stamina points. And depending on the number of players that you're playing with, you get a bonus on stamina if you're playing with just 1 or 2 players. But if you're playing with more than that, and I don't know how many players this holds, there's got to be a limit, but there's not much. They say 1 to 6 players. I think in more than about 3, you're going to have so few decisions to make in the game that it would kind of, be kind of too much. On the other hand, I think playing a pure solo might be fun as a choose your own adventure type of game, but I think you're probably missing some of the opportunity of a social interaction in this kind of thing. Being able to enjoy the experience. I know for me, I would rather, I don't really get a kick out of playing, solo dungeon adventure type things or stuff like that terribly much, where it's the narrative that's of interest. I tend to enjoy them a lot more. And I would compare this, say, to Consulting Detective in terms of what it kind of feels like. If you enjoy playing consulting detective on your own and puzzling it out all by yourself, that's great. I personally, what other option is there than personally? I feel that that's a lot more fun when you have someone else to enjoy the storyline with and just share it with. But, you know, I read books by myself, so why not this? I don't know. Okay, so anyway, that's basically the gist of the character creation, is you're going to be getting to these skills, and then within those skills, beyond that, you're going to be able to get, you know, you have your racial and class selection, which might have some effect on the story, but very minimal. For the actual rules of the game, they basically tell you, don't worry about the rules. You'll learn them as you play. And that's largely correct. I think it's not a bad idea to read through the rules glossary, though, which tells you some of the stuff that you're going to learn. There aren't a lot of things that you really have to know, though. But if you're not careful in reading the rules as you go, you may find that you can make mistakes. I've read some of the comments from people saying that, oh, we screwed the whole thing up, you know, because we did something wrong. Honestly, I think that's being a little, that's probably misinterpreting the experience, at least from what I can see. If you screw up a rule in the game, you're probably going to either cheat in favor or against yourself to some degree. The main rule in the game, this is a choose-your-own-adventure style game. The main rule in the game is that, well, it differs in two different kinds of locations. But the main rule in the game is, if you're playing multiple players, usually one person at a time is the active player, and they get to make all the decisions for that particular moment. And that's handled with these little activation tokens, which you flip over to indicate that you've used your activation. And what you're going to do is you look at a page, you see something like this, and that indicates that you're making a choice as the active player. Once you've made that choice, if you get to something that's like this, it's continuing to use you as the active player. So only your skills and qualities affect anything. Now, there's other things that may affect things that aren't your skills and qualities. Notably, there's this whole list of story points, and you can see we finished the campaign and we didn't mark most of these. Maybe a third of them went through. These are when you come to certain decisions or certain events that happen, how they turn out, you mark them down, and they'll affect the story as a whole as you go further and further into it. And the game is at about probably the limit of what you could, I don't know how they developed this, but it's hard to imagine them being able to succeed in capturing more story points than they've actually captured here and getting it all balanced to work correctly. There's a number of different adventures in the campaign, and as things happen, you know, you mark them down, and then other parts of the story are going to keep track of what these are and whether or not you can do something, whether or not something's in effect, whatever. And as you get too many of these, it would start to get complicated, or it would start to feel fake in the sense that maybe, you know, a special item that you think should be able to be used in some case can't be used, or could be used, but it's not being offered. There is some of that already anyway. You keep track of a couple of other things, your fame and your gold as a party. And the whole party has the same fame value, has the same gold value, has the same time, and has the same progress in terms of skills that you're sort of working, well, not skills, but sets of skills that you're sort of working towards. And you get bonuses as you do things. If they're heroic things, once you reach the set of this, you'll get a bonus on that. So for example, here, you get a point of experience and your fame increases by 1 if you get enough heroism. We actually didn't manage to get the second level of heroism, which is better because you get some extra stamina. Stamina is going to be important. Normally you lose stamina because you got injured. Sometimes you may lose it due to mental fatigue or something like that as well. You'll recover your stamina pretty regularly. That might be kind of a spoiler. Like, you're really worried about your stamina in the first adventure, and then you realize, gee, I slept overnight and I get a bunch of stamina back and I feel better. You don't get fully back, but you get healed, and you can get healed by eating and stuff like that as well. You'll be tracking items individually per player. So in general, one person's carrying an item, and they're the only person who can use it if they're the active player. There are some rules for passing items, which basically come down to, as long as both people have their activation token face up, they can exchange an item between each other, and you can drink a potion if your activation is face up. But if one of the two people involved in an exchange, if their activation is not face up, it's probably not going to work. You can only give it away if you're face up, and you can only use it if you're face up, which kind of means if you need a healing potion or something like that, you may have to wait till the cycle comes around. Now, the way this works is everybody gets one turn, but those turns aren't necessarily in any fixed order. So if I took a turn, and for example, my wife and I were playing 2-player. If I took a turn, I'd be flipped face down, and now the next choice is automatically my wife's. If it's 3 players, you have to wait until the 2 other players have gone before you all flip back over. Basically, everybody has to go once, then you flip back over, and then as a group, you can choose for anybody in the group to take the next activation. You do get to see what the options are on the activation, so you can say, oh, I'm good at that, I'll do this one, because I'm face up right now. I have the right to do it, and I like the idea of doing it, just from the paragraph side. Now, this all kind of changes in one section in the book, which is actually where a lot of the stuff's going to be happening, which is the Dragonholt village. You reach here, and what happens with this, unlike the others, is you're going to use this map of the village, which isn't too important spatially. I haven't found any spatial relationship to it. So for example, in Consulting Detective, sometimes you use the map to figure out how long it would take someone to get from point A to point B in order to get there. For this, you just, and it doesn't matter for you, it just matters in terms of like trying to figure out, could somebody have done the murder and gotten to where they're known to be in time or something like that. In this, though, the only real purpose of it is to tell you these numbers that you go to. And that'll be the starting paragraph to go to that location. When you're in the village, the starting location number actually just tells you where you go. And you start your, whatever choices you have, go from that. So let's find a location here. So the Market Street. So for example, you'll have rules for the Market Street. They tell you whether or not you look down further, and then for each day of the adventure. It turns out there's only 7 days in the adventure, which is very clearly obvious from some of the play sheets. That can trigger you to specific day-based adventure cases, and they can be even more specific. They can be related to the amount of time that you've spent in a given day. So, for example, let's find the other sheet here. This one tracks what time of day it is. And as time passes, you mark it off on there. And the things you do take up your time, and they, have an opportunity cost. There's other things you could do. In the village, the difference is that one person is the active player. They still flip their token, etc. However, everybody's allowed to use their capabilities in the same action. But the player who's active gets to make all the choices. Now, other people can give input on those choices, and that's encouraged, but the player who's active is the one who has the final say on it. And what that means is, if you decide to pick someone's pocket, you could use the thief skill to do that instead of your own skills, which might not be as good. And you can force the thief to go do that or whatever. You're not you're all working kind of cooperatively. There's no winning and losing among the players. That's really about it in all of this. Some of the other things are here to explain some other aspects, but that's really the important thing here. Some things like potions, you use them up and they give you some abilities and then they go away. Skills, in particular paragraphs, and I'll show you something. They'll say something, like some of the abilities will give you options. So for example, here, you can do something if you, and I really shouldn't be showing this one, but you gotta kind of show something to show it. You have to have a specific item here. You might have to spend some money to do something. In others, you might have to have a skill, like if you're trying to steal coins, you might need thievery skill to accomplish that. And the same kind of pattern goes through all the books. Some of them work into these, where if you have a certain ability, you'll get what is presumably a preferred effect, but it might actually be conceivably negative. I don't think I ran into any where having a skill was a negative thing, like it is in Tales of the Arabian Nights sometimes, where they have the mandatory skill effects or anything like that. This is actually almost pure choose your own adventure within the concepts of skills, etc. You're given a choice, you take it, you flip, and then your skills all affect whether or not you succeed in it, but it's all hard coded. It's all really deterministic. So if you know everything about the game, you're gonna pretty much be able to push your way through with no problem. How much replay it has, that's a big question. I guess if you fail the first time you play and don't get a good result, you might be more inclined to play again. My wife and I got through it pretty well. We didn't do everything that's possible. I don't think you can, but and there's more to explore, and that would be interesting. But we know the main storyline, and we have some pretty good ideas how to succeed. Some of those ideas, though, are based on the skills we had. We had, I took a very combat-oriented character with a combination of magical and straight combat skills, and she took more of a utility character with alchemy, which ended up very good in combat, actually, believe it or not, and some more interpersonal skills, but she actually didn't take a lot of skills. I took near the maximum, and she took not near the maximum. She took the minimum, which meant she had a lot more stamina, which is kind of useful. Personally, I like having a big range of skills better, because it means you're more likely to be successful and take less stamina loss. But it all balances out. The actual play of it, they give some time for which each of the adventures is going to take. So like generally a day in the village is going to take you between a half hour and about an hour. But you might get the opportunity to buzz into one of these in the midst of a day. And that's kind of painful, because you may want to or need to do one of those, and maybe you're counting on this only taking about an hour, and now you see, okay, well, now I'm entering this, and it's going to take maybe up to an hour and a half more. You can, of course, pause and leave yourself partially through a day. We generally finished a day at a time without worrying about that. You actually don't start in the village. You start with, that is a lot of them, there's 2 new roads, and you start with the information contained in a little letter. And then you could eventually get some of these other items, the map, the journal. I think you're pretty assured to get both of those. And then some of the items in here that I don't want to show you, you're not supposed to see them. The way that that's kept is they have a letter on back, and you only pull them out as you discover them. So you don't know what the items are in advance. All right. I'll come back with some further words beyond the actual sort of mechanisms. It doesn't seem like I've given you much in mechanisms, but it really is go from one page to the other. It's like a very, very cleverly constructed choose your own adventure, where the combination of the skills that you have, the items that you've had, the story points that you've marked, all direct your positioning in a deterministic fashion. So combat doesn't involve dice or anything. It still involves the same thing. Making choices, the skills you have to back those choices up, which aren't necessarily obvious. They're usually intuitive, though. There's general skills that are useful to you. And then if you don't, then you get, losses of stamina as you go. There's another rule. Once your stamina hits 0, it's reset at 1, but you lose one of your skills temporarily. Those can also come back through resting. Only over a night's rest do they come back. There might be some other kind of healing that gives you them back. I think the healing potion may. But if you get beat up badly enough that you're going to fall down a skill, if you don't have a healing potion or some way to heal between, after you've fallen down, it's quite likely that your other stamina losses will keep taking a skill each time, and you'll just start degenerating very, very rapidly. Also, some of these have a track on them for time, and some of them have other tracks that you have to work on, like progress through that adventure, which might indicate how many hits of damage you've kind of done to the enemy monsters, the big bad monsters. The other monsters will be handled just, fairly easily. You have to, you take care of them through a single series of paragraphs. But some of the bigger monsters or some of the bigger hordes of monsters, you have to get a certain amount of success before you get to the finale of the adventure, essentially. At heart, this is a mystery, though, to some extent. So some of the things that you have to resolve there, well, knowing about them in advance is going to hurt some of the value in terms of replayability. I think we'll be able to do this again in a few years without it being, we'll still remember some of it, but without it being too repetitive feeling. But yeah. Okay. And I figure I'm going to give you some FaceTime on a review or something. I'm not sure why. It really doesn't make much difference, does it? But my wife and I played this as a campaign and made it all the way through with several hours of fun. It's not the kind of thing that I think you'd want to do necessarily with any group of players, or definitely not with any group of players, because it really is just a choose your own adventure game. Within that, how many times can you make your way through a choose your own adventure book? This is a very heavy one. It's got a lot going on in it. It's not like, buying a little paperback and flipping through it once. It comes closer because of the combat, the skills, interactions, and everything, to say some of the stuff that used to show up. I think probably the best comparison was the old Roll Master Choose Your Own Adventure books, where you'd have to fight out a battle, battles within that, or you'd have to use skills within it, and you'd have to make checks. And in those, if your skill check succeeded, you went to a positive result. If it failed, you went to a negative result. In this, it's really just, do you have the skill or not? And that's sufficient. It's a simpler system. They did kind of a neat thing by baking all of it into the rules or into the adventure books, instead of making a complicated rules-based system to handle the skills the way that, say, Roll Master, Choose Your Own Adventures, Solo Adventures for RuneQuest, and other games of the sort have, which is, they decided they'd bake it all directly into the books. You either have the skill and it works, or you don't, but it's not a clear cut. You have to make the right choice to do something that maybe your skills support, but maybe it's not quite the skills you think it's going to be. So, for example, something might require a skill to go forward, like, trying to sneak up and ambush someone or something. You might think, well, sneaking this or something else, but it might turn out that it's awareness that's important, that you notice that maybe there's additional forces coming behind that. And you don't want to ambush because, you know, now it's more dangerous than you thought it was, and you end up not taking that risky maneuver. That's just an example. It may not even be in the game. One of the things that may seem a little weird, this isn't a regular fantasy milieu. They've kind of gone out of their way, and I know some people saw this as good, some as bad, whatever, some as overblown. I don't think anybody's like, oh, that's just horrible, but I'm sure there are people who think that, even if they're not willing to say it. And I've got to say, there's an incongruity to it. You're used to your standard fantasy, right? You know, where there's a certain gender bias to the roles. You don't usually see female warriors, for example. Here, the characters are spread out among, and gender doesn't affect anything in terms of in terms of any expectations. You know, they can have skills just the same, and there's a certain value to that. There's no question of that. It totally does not play into the sort of assumed gender roles that standard fantasy games often play towards. However, by doing that, it doesn't feel like perhaps as believable a world. I don't mind the hulking she-orc warrior at all. That's believable. But in some of the other cases, it doesn't necessarily seem any more believable than the chainmail bikini warrior. You know, it feels like, yeah, you know, there's a reason men are physically different from women, and at least with humans, you don't necessarily expect a lot of hand-to-hand combat capable women. And it's about 50-50 in this, between men and women. I don't know what to think of that. I certainly wouldn't want to limit a player character's choice in that way. But the whole world seems to be based along this. Yeah, anybody can be anything. There's also significant, you know, cases of same-sex relationships. There's at least, you know, hints of other more modern-feeling things. And there's sort of a, okay, you know, I don't mind it. I enjoy it in its own way. It's interesting, and I actually kind of play with that. But it also gives a kind of feeling of incongruity, and I can see some people who are like, well, that's not what I expect fantasy to be like. Damn it, I want, you know, my males to be in male gender specific roles for the most part, and I don't want all this acceptance of alternative lifestyles and stuff like that in it. And I know some people didn't like that aspect of it, or didn't feel, maybe they didn't care about it themselves, but didn't feel like they could play it with their children because somehow that seems wrong. I don't know why. You know, once the culture and the society as a whole have accepted something, it's going to be baked into everything that culture and society have. This seems like a step further than normal. But, you know, if you want to believe in a fantasy world where there's happens to be more tolerance than there is in the modern world in actuality, this has got that. It may seem a little odd. It may not. Beyond that, though, for the actual play, you know, my wife and I are playing it. I did all the reading because I get kind of cranky with her reading, or anybody else, to tell you the truth. But because I'm doing it all, I'm taking on different, I position a voice with each character. which I think added something to it. And it makes it kind of an interesting way to do it. So if you've got somebody who's a total ham and, you know, can try to keep track of different voices for all the characters, that added a lot to it, I think. I don't know. I know she had fun with some of the voices that I was pulling off. I know I enjoy doing things like that. It does add a little bit of a burden in terms of like trying to figure out who's speaking it sometimes so that you can do the correct voices. Same thing with doing voices in, you know, a normal novel as opposed to a play where it indicates all the different people. So that was kind of a fun part of it. I think we had a lot of fun with it. I don't think that 1 to 6 players is necessarily optimal. I would say probably the sweet spot is 2 to 3 players, because much more than that, you're not going to get many decisions, you're not going to get many opportunities to use your skills, etc. There are penalties to larger groups where, you know, you have to pay a certain amount of money per person that's involved in the group, which are kind of painful. There's kind of everybody takes damage situations, which would be bad the larger the group because you're spreading that damage out. And there's a few other things where it might be, you wouldn't be getting much advantage for the penalties that you're taking in that case. I think it's pretty hard to die in it. We got in some situations where it felt like we weren't necessarily being given the right options. So that's one of the things that I don't like about this paragraph system and the pulsing, the play pulsing based on these chips, which I really got to put in the box, which is that there are times when you're in a fight and one of you has an ability or a magic item or something, and if just one of you was playing, you could keep using that. You could keep using your abilities, you could keep doing what you're good at. But instead, you've got a support character with you and a fighting character, and the fighting character may be very, very good at fighting, but you can't kind of step in as often and take the brunt of the fight. The other character is going to get called off. And at some points, it feels like the switch hits kind of at the wrong point. You're like, oh yeah, I'm going to go forward and take care of this fight, and then you're forced to switch players at that point. At other points, you don't know what's going on. So a lot of times you're kind of left with well, we don't know who's going to get the option. You know, I think I'm going into a fight, but then it's going to switch characters. Or I think I think it might switch characters, so I'm going to have, you know, the less combat capable one go first. And then it doesn't switch characters, and the other one ends up stuck, you know, in a more combat-oriented situation that they're not as prepared for. Also, some of the items, they're tagged with a certain person, and it just ends up in a situation where you can't exchange the item because of the exhaustion, who's exhausted, who's not, and you can't choose to use it because you're not the active player. When it feels like somebody in the group should be able to fire off that special item the few times in the game that you can use it. And it really kind of is that way. There's some special items that can be used for a few special circumstances. They're very, very powerful, seeming at least. But I know I kept feeling boned because I was holding it, so I handed it off to my wife. And then she wasn't able to use it, but it just kind of worked out that we were very seldom able to use it when we thought we should be able to. And it would have, it seemed like it would have improved our situation quite a bit. You know, there's a few cases where you don't know for sure whether or not you're going to be able to get something constructed. And in some cases you can get it constructed immediately, in other cases you'll be told to come back the next day. And it's not obvious within the context of the game which one it's going to be. And once you make the choice to ask, you've spent time. And it might be very, very important that you not spend time if you're getting nothing at that moment, especially in the very last day of the game, where you know you're not going to get another chance to pick it up. Do you want to go for it or not? And you can make some choices that are just bad choices within the structure of the game. Does it kill you? Not necessarily, but it may take away some advantages, and if you're running close, it may be an issue. But anyway, overall, even with all these issues in play and kind of, geez, I feel like the rule book and its structure screwed me over at certain times. And it can get frustrating. Maybe for most of an adventure it can be frustrating. But throughout the whole campaign, I felt like overall it did a pretty good job of holding together, even with that kind of pulsing that feels unnatural at times. And we had a great time with it. The only problem with it is, you know, and it's got to do with the amount of book there is in here to make this thing work. This is not a cheap game. It's, I don't know what it ran, you know, but 80, 90 bucks, somewhere in that range. At a store. Not, I'm sure you can find it cheaper online. But I kind of want to support my local store a little bit. Now that I have one that I actually use, you know, to the extent where, you know, it's easier for me to order things online because they come to my home. I don't have to carry them home through potential rain or whatever and lug it on my back. But both the extra money and hauling something seems worthwhile, at least to some extent, especially when they sell me on the game. I would have never even known about this if I hadn't been gaming down there. So this seems a particular case, one of a couple particular cases where I've hauled the games home, you know, rather than buy it right at the store, or rather than order it online. It's a lot of money to pay for really what feels like kind of a one-shot adventure. But then again, a book is a lot of money to pay for a one read. That's something I don't do. I don't pay, I don't know, paperbacks are like 10 bucks each now, maybe 12 bucks. I see scary numbers on them and I'm like, I remember them being like $2 and thinking that was high because I can usually get them used for a quarter. Well, you can't get them used for a quarter anymore at the Goodwills or whatever, but maybe at tag sales you still can. You can also, where I am, you can get them from free lending, these free, you know, people set up these little library huts outside their house, little tiny things, and you can just like take a book from there, bring books back, whatever. And I find that incredibly refreshing and exciting. And to some extent, you know, maybe that's kind of the game market. Maybe you wait until this comes out used. My hope is that there will be further, like there'll be expansions that you obviously have to pay more money for, maybe some fan-written stuff that I don't expect much of in terms of the books holding up well. But things where there's an advantage to bringing your character, not bringing the, you know, bringing the same character to other adventures, maybe based on how well you did on something or whatever. Maybe with modifiers, depending on whether or not you went through the previous or if it's another standalone. Because the actual rules isn't much. It's the adventure that takes up all the space and all the effort in it. It's a fun thing to do socially. I would rather, you know, rather than play this solo, I would rather play a computer game that gives the same kind of story and excitement to it. And it could just be the same kind of choose your own adventure instead of a more complex, you know, hack and slash type computer game, or you know, a more tactical one where you have the common RPG elements where you get to position your units and they all fight, turn-based RPGs, whatever. I don't see any reason not to have those elements in it, given that they're fairly easy to add to a game. But you can find free games that are just choose your own adventure type things online. And, you know, for solo, I'm fine with that. For the experience of being with someone else or a couple other people and enjoying the story in this way, there's something really neat about this. And the fact that this supports it better than, say, pulling out a Middle-earth role-playing solo adventure does, or a RuneQuest solo adventure does. I think it adds a little something to it that's kind of cool. I felt like the world is a little generic, other than this weird, to me, discontinuity of like modern sexuality spectrum. Oh, someday soon we'll get into my sexual identity and stuff like that, gender identity, sorry, which I have my issues there, and it has more to do with linguistic association than anything else, because I believe more in linguistic distinctions than I do in social distinctions. That may be because how I'm wired, but whatever. Anyway, I think this can be a lot of fun, and it can be pretty damn interesting to play through. I think the story's kind of neat, and I had a lot of fun. My wife had a lot of fun with it. I think it may make her take a chance at trying role-playing again. She's still terribly worried that I'll be a total bitch about it and be like, no, you have to try to make your character richer, deeper, or whatever. Well, with this, I think we found I think we both learned something about, she learned something about what role-playing can be, and I learned something about how she works in this, which I kind of knew, but this gave an ability for us to open that communication up again in a way that kind of pleases me, and gives me some hope that we can find something, I hope, in terms of getting regular role-playing going. But two-player role-playing sucks, so this gives an option for it. All right, let's send this up, and just something for consideration, right? It's not something I'm going to be able to demo without giving spoilers all over the place.